It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is broadcast number 535. It's March the 7th, 1982. I'm going to run down just some very quick titles of articles that I hope we'll get into later in future broadcasts, but most of the evening I'm going to talk about two or three of some very, very important articles I want to spend most of the time on. One of those articles is Tumble in Tampa, the Wall Street Journal, March 3rd, 1982. The other is The Company They Keep from the Soho News, November 24th, 1981. And the third story is The CIA Goes to War, February the 14th, 1982, The Washington Post. And I will get back some more to Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig. And I'll do some more on Kirk Kerkorian, Caesar's Palace, MGM, the Hollywood mob connections to the assassination teams. But I do want to get on these other articles this evening and go into detail about those particular articles. Just briefly, I will not do details on the death of Belushi, John Belushi. I will do more on that, as I promised I would, on William Holden, and some more on Natalie Wood later. I have my opinions on this death. I think it was a murder just the same type as the rock musicians and artists of the left, and I'll do details on why I believe that. There's a play in London, reviewed just this last week. It's about Adolf Hitler. It's called The Portage to San Cristobal of Adolf Hitler. It's about Adolf Hitler wandering in the jungle in Brazil, and a large part of the play is a justification of his genocide and his policies, and he stands up to defend what he did in Germany. It caused a consternation in England. It's considered very, very controversial, and the interesting thing was the location of Hitler in Brazil, because this, of course, maybe you know I've alleged, is where he was 2 years ago until he was seen at his birthday party and left Brazil at the time. There's a new book out, Bitter Fruit, The Untold Story of the American Coup in Guatemala by Stephen Schlesinger and Stephen Kinzer, and it goes into the controversy of Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, overthrowing Guatemala for the United Fruit Company, and how the headquarters for United Fruit were up in Boston, and the people such as Henry Cabot Lodge giving speeches in the Senate denouncing the Red Menace in Guatemala, while he overturned it while his family had holdings and money in United Fruit. John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, was making remarks about the Reds in Guatemala and why they had to put in a fascist military regime when they had financial interests, and Undersecretary of State Bedell Smith also went on the board of directors of the fruit company. They had a democracy for the first time in 100 years, and I bring that up because if it sounds familiar, there are good books on Guatemala, and this is exactly what we're doing again in Central America today. The Los Angeles Times has an article February 19th, 1982. David Murdoch, I've done some broadcasts on David Murdoch, and he teamed up with Arm & Hammer, that's Occidental Petroleum, and the Hooker Canal, the Love Canal. They're now in the meat-producing business together. They have a corporation that they've joined together, and the attorney is going to be Louis Nizer. Robert Haldeman, who works for David Murdoch, I've said was part of the assassination team of Richard Nixon's administration with the Wallace shooting, the Chappaquiddick affair, the dirty tricks that went on. And Louis Nizer, of course, is now representing Mo Dalitz and the organized crime syndicate down La Costa in the suit against Penthouse. And he wrote the introduction to the Warren Report. This group of people from the legal institutions, the law enforcement agencies, organized crime that have been part of the assassination teams are merging now, huge corporations merging together, but they keep the same team members. Paraquat was been approved for U.S. spraying the United States marijuana crop. I did many broadcasts on that when it was sprayed down in Mexico. Jimmy Carter gave $43 million of our taxes to Dow Chemical to put poisoning on the paraquat on marijuana so that the young generation, whoever had it and was smoking it, will maybe 10 or 15 years from now get cancer of the lungs or other chemical diseases. The Dow Chemical is produced by Exxon, Standard Oil, Chase Manhattan, but is a part of the Shell Oil, the Queen Juliana Prince Bernhard operation coming out of the Netherlands. It's going to be used in the United States. The Drug Enforcement Agency that used 2,4-D is going to be spraying this on the marijuana fields. I might have mentioned before that James Brady is suing the Hinckley family for $46 million. I'm glad to see that he's not going to sit back and after having his head blown off and almost dying, and he still has serious problems, they're suing the Hinckley family, as is Mr. Delahanty, who was also damaged at the shootings. Even though Ronald Reagan is playing very nice about the shooting, the murder attempt on his life, because of the high implications of the Hinckley family with the CIA. Ronald Reagan got the message. He's alive, but these other people are suing. There were awards this last week for the George Polk Award for Journalism for Radio and Journalism, and I was glad to see that for national reporting, Seymour Hersh, Jeff Gerth, and Philip Taubman of the New York Times got their awards for investigating the intelligence agents, Frank Churchill, Edwin Wilson, George Corcola. They've left Corcola out of a lot of their articles, but they did get awards for that reporting, and I think they deserved them, and I think those are the number one story, these fellows in the country for the past 2 years. San Francisco article, March the 1st attempt to kill Gaddafi, confirmed by the CIA, the United States, and the CIA had evidence there were plans to murder Gaddafi. We said he was coming here to kill our officials, and yet there were complicated plans, and people around him were hurt and shot. The notorious terrorist Carlos, according to the newspaper yesterday, Saturday, March the 6th, surfaces again in Holland. He's out to destabilize Mitterrand and the French, and Giscard d'Estaing is waiting in the wings to become president of France again. Carlos has always worked for Frank Churchill, Edwin Wilson, Samuel Cummings, and the CIA, and they're resurrecting Carlos to destabilize Europe. Henry Kissinger was on the cover of Time, praising Alexander Haig for saving the nation and being so righteous at the time of Watergate, when their agent, James McCord, was leaving Scotch tape on the door to make sure that Nixon got out and that Haig had his finger on the White House tapes. They pull this hanky-panky and get the president out of office, put their own people in, which was really a military coup to compound the one in Dallas in '63. And then Henry Kissinger comes out to praise Haig. Vanderbilt Energy can't find a buyer. That's the Hinckley family in Denver. Doesn't mention Vanderbilt Resources. Nobody's coming up with money for the oil and gas company, and the Hinckley family is having trouble selling it. And I'm sure they want to unload it before they're caught with these lawsuits, and everything they get is wiped out. Malcolm X's brother says someone steered the three killers to Malcolm X, and he finally, I don't know where he's been all these years, is saying there was a conspiracy to kill his brother, and that was in the Houston Post. Libyan hit squads are still here. William Casey has to say me too, and so the San Francisco Examiner had a story, ridiculous story, that they're out here trying to kill our public officials. The FALN, the Fallen, is bombing Wall Street. They're letting off bombs. The Puerto Rican nationalist group that was set up by George Corcola, Frank Churchill, and the CIA, because terrorism is the means by which they'll have the people under their control, not knowing where the bombs will fall next, and putting the police squads on the streets. Washington Post letters say Chile aided the Letelier murder figure. This is Michael Townley, who is in jail, and now he's squealing about the real connections of the murdered Orlando Letelier. Joseph Kraft had a long article on the accomplice to Mahatma Jah, who shot the Pope, and the arrest in Hamburg. They admitted there was a conspiracy. This fellow was with Jah. It's called The Shooting of the Pope, a Byzantine Mystery. Another article in the Washington Post, the FBI wonders if the departing agents of the FBI stripped their files on racketeers before they left. And this has to do with the trial in La Costa, an organized crime suing Penthouse magazine for accusing them of being organized crime. And there were documents numbered and identified in the FBI that to accomplish these syndicates from not being exposed, the documents have been taken. Of course, J. Edgar Hoover was close to Mo Dalitz and to members of organized crime across the country, the gamblers, the syndicates, the entire mob. He always said there was no mob, and J. Edgar Hoover was very close to them. So the offices have been sanitized. And Wells Fargo Bank has been accused of slander. The Hollywood office, the manager of the Hollywood office, Joseph Moffett, is complaining that he was slandered when they said he approved of $3.5 million in loans in Tennessee. There hasn't been a case on this because to open this up would bring up the whole can of worms of the Wells Fargo missing hundreds of millions of dollars. So he's saying they haven't brought it out, so therefore he wants a settlement of money because he was slandered. It's easier to pay him a little money on the slander than to bring out the whole case. And finally, on the brief mention of news, Ted Charach has been given a sentence. He's going to jail. He's the man who made the movie The Second Gun, who investigated the Robert Kennedy assassination and was there when Robert Kennedy was murdered. He did a monumental job. Ted went to Europe in 1979 and 1980 and in 1981. And he went on tickets that people had parlayed and forged. They wrote somebody else's name on. They took like airline tickets from one city to the other that were $21 and wrote them to 210 and then made them like 2,100. And a woman and a man, one person's left town, isn't in L.A. and hasn't been charged. A mystery witness has gone. But Ted accepted these trips to Europe. And the trips, even though he didn't forge the signatures, they were forged. And he used those airline tickets, and he may be going to jail for 9 years. The Los Angeles Police Department has him in jail, and he was convicted of fraud with the airline tickets. And the moral of that is if you're going to do research and point out all the murderous habits of the Los Angeles coroner, the chief of police, the mayor, and all the officials of Los Angeles at the time Robert Kennedy was murdered, if you're going to do that, then you better buy your own ticket to Europe or not go at all, because you can have entrapment, but that doesn't protect you. So Charach was convicted. It's very sad, but he's such a flaky guy. He called me when he was first arrested, wanted me to help him. I said, you're so unreliable and flaky that I wouldn't even be able to separate truth from fiction. I can't help you because you're not consistent, and you are with such weird people. He's brought the weirdest people up to my house, and I can't believe the kind of company he keeps and the kind of research he's trying to do. And entrapment is a perfect way to get Ted Charach, and there's no way to save him because he can't distinguish the kind of people he's going to associate with, and he fell into that trap. Now, the first article I'm going into, and I hope I have time for all three, is Tumble in Tampa, How a Bank Flourished by Taking Chances, Then Slid to Its Ruin. This has to do with a bank. The lead article in the Wall Street Journal says, Metropolitan Bank and Trust Company of Tampa, Florida, became the victim of glut of bad real estate loans. This article includes, they said, Boy Scouts, gems, and a jet. The Boy Scouts is money that the leaders of the Boy Scouts put in a bank that collapsed. The gems are $1 million worth of buried diamonds that were in the backyard in Florida. And the jet has to do with the Air Florida crash that I've been talking about for the past 5 or 6 weeks. The missing millions that involve the bank scandal, there's $53 to $100 million missing in Fort Collins, Colorado. Fort Collins, Colorado is the city where Mr. Tafoya, who worked with Edwin Wilson, was convicted of shooting somebody from Libya. And this is a headquarters. Wilson and Turple are active in that city, but I don't know if there's links, but there is this connection of Fort Collins that I haven't heard in the news except in the Tafoya trial. And Atlanta, Georgia, there's $51.4 million in loan missing. And of course, it was in Atlanta where the C-130s, Lockheed planes, were made for Gaddafi, and he couldn't get them delivered from there. So Neil Burke went to London, picked up money, and through Air Alaska and other companies, they ended up with Gaddafi anyway. So the airplanes that Gaddafi had ordered were in Atlanta, and Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple's agent Tafoya was in Fort Collins. And out of Fort Collins is missing $53 to $100 million, and out of Atlanta, $51.4 million. Now, the Wall Street Journal says in 1974, in Tampa, Florida, the Metropolitan Bank opened. They started with $10.5 million that day. They did well for the next few years. They changed the title to Metropolitan Bank and Trust. And then February the 12th this year, just 2 weeks after the air crash, or a month after the Air Florida crash, that was January the 13th, the FBI moved in and closed the bank and took everything out and began to investigate them. And the remains of the bank were sold for $18 million. the bank began to disintegrate, and the chief investigator for the bank scandal at the time that they were going into the problems of these missing millions of dollars was a Mr. Williams, who, strangely enough, was on that Air Florida flight when it went down. And those of you that listen to the broadcast that I have on KLRB, back in, it was broadcast number 530, I was talking about this Mr. Williams, Arland Williams, and the newspaper described him as coming from Atlanta, Georgia. He's the fellow who was supposed to have drowned, who was rescuing 5 other people that he gave the lifeline to, and the coroner said he died from exposure or drowning. But the thing that was strange about this man that I mentioned on the program when I was listing a lot of reasons why I believe there was sabotage or hanky-panky right from the beginning was that the Washington, D.C. police told the paramedic named Gene Windsor, don't cooperate with the news, don't tell or identify this man. Now, how in the world would, the minute the plane crashed, there's 78 killed, and there's only a handful of survivors, but the police are saying that they had instructions, this particular man, not to cooperate or talk with the news media, and don't attempt to identify him by viewing the file photographs shown to them by the news organization. Now, I saved that article. There were many articles on the air crash, but that really got to me. It was January the 20th, 1982, the Washington Post, and the conflict of don't identify this person and this Mr. Williams. Arland D. Williams, a 46-year-old directing bank examiner for the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta, a balding man with a mustache. And the Park Police in Washington said the man definitely didn't have a beard, and they made up a different description of him and denied who they were looking at. Now, what did the Park Police know so early? I mean, the plane just left. The man was there, and goodness knows, out of 78 people, and they're all smashed. I couldn't figure out why the Park Police in Washington, D.C., that came swooping in on this particular accident had any interest at all whether somebody was identified or not. That seemed weird. Now it seems that the man that the Park Police was arguing about was a very controversial person, because he was the man, according to the Wall Street Journal, who was about to investigate this particular bank and the large amount of money missing. Now, they describe it as the biggest bank failure in the United States since 1976, which gets close to Michael Sindona, the Franklin National Bank for $45 million, and the Franklin Trust Bank for what was another 60 or 100 million in New York. And Fred Bartello, a millionaire who built a shopping center, was in charge of this bank. He bought the majority interest in the bank. And a Richard Greco, described as the right-hand man of Edward D. Bartello, the former mayor of Tampa. He was vice president of Super Bowl champion San Francisco 49ers. Richard Greco is still chairman of the Metropolitan Bank Corp, and he was involved with this bank. They had a sudden demise where a large amount of money was missing. It had to do with a man named Alan Wolfson, W-O-L-F-S-E-N, who was being investigated by a grand jury because of millions of dollars in loans that he got from this bank. But he never presented any collateral. He would go to the bank, the Metropolitan Bank, and this reminds me of the Wells Fargo stories, the Hollywood branch, the Beverly Hills branch, the Wilshire branch, where they could go with no collateral. Whoever Mr. Alan Wolfson is, he could take millions of dollars, just take them out of this bank, and he didn't have to put up any collateral for it. Alan Wolfson was described in the Wall Street Journal as earlier being involved with fraud convictions, and he got away with different problems with the law, which they listed in the article, and was not ever put in jail. He'd get a fine and a slap on the wrist, and he could be back in business. He was a New Yorker who moved to Florida. He landed in trouble with the law, and then he would, as I say, get out of it. He became the owner of 2 banks in Tennessee. Now, there's been a lot of scandals about missing money in Tennessee, and it's also a place where the CIA has functioned. Albert Osborne worked with Permindex out of Tennessee. John Hinckley Jr. had contacts in Tennessee. There's a Nazi core, a hard group of Nazis in Tennessee. Memphis, Tennessee is where Martin Luther King was killed, where there's a large group of the Klan, the Nazi Party. There's a lot of money that came out of the Hollywood branch of Wells Fargo, $3.6 million into Tennessee. Tennessee is mentioned in a lot of articles I have with money connections that are unexplained and also espionage connections that have not been linked to the money yet, but it's a lot of what I call floating money. Wilson was the owner of 2 banks in Tennessee, and he was considered a millionaire. He worked with a man named Donald Rieger, R-E-G-A-R, who ran the Metropolitan Bank, and he had associates that would put up money, and they would invest it. They got tied up with a man named George Wagneux, W-U-A-G-N-E-U-X, in the Metropolitan Bank. And when George needed money, Wilson would go and say, give it to him. He'd bail him out of the money. And they began to take these tremendous loans of $1.7 million, $2.7 million, these loans. And Wilson borrowed another $5 million. And it goes on and on. The banks were, various banks in Atlanta and in Fort Collins began to be drained of millions of dollars. It added up to millions of dollars. Wilson got caught with embezzlement of railroad funds up in New Jersey, of Morristown and Erie Railroad, New Jersey. And he used the money from the railroad funds to buy a Florida St. Petersburg shopping center. He got out of court on that. He paid $450,000 fine, and he got out of that. He put up these loans with no collateral and no reason for Mr. Wagneux in Florida, but he wasn't convicted, and Wagneux went on to Arizona, moved on to Arizona, where he was charged with some labor frauds. They used money for bank stock. Wilson took money he borrowed from the bank to buy stock in the bank, which is illegal under federal laws. In Tampa, he bribed bank officers to get favorable loans, and then he would repay the loan. And he was convicted also of, as I say, the embezzlement railroad funds, and he got off of that in 1980. He was in trouble again with illegal contributions to political candidates, and then he got tied up with a group of people where the money really was missing huge amount, as much as $50 million in one area and $10.5 million in another place. And when they totaled it all up, according to the Wall Street Journal, the Fort Collins, Colorado banks, there was 53 to 100 million gone. The investors lost. In Fort Collins, Colorado, and Atlanta, Georgia, it came to 51.4 million. Now, the article goes on to say at the end that the bank examiner for the Metropolitan Bank, who was doing the research on this, was spared temporarily the bank by the death of Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams was on Air Florida in Washington, D.C. He was the one believed to be the heroic passenger. He was the examiner for the Metropolitan Bank in Tampa that was going under, that was under criminal investigation, and all the newspapers said he was from Atlanta, Georgia. On Friday, February the 12th, the Atlanta people said that they were out 51.4 million of loans. So tying the missing millions, which I love to follow, and the Air Florida, the witness and the person who was investigating it, he was on that ill-fated plane. Now, just to update a few more controversies on that plane, because I maintain that it was sabotaged. There were several articles this week investigating. One, the San Francisco Examiner, March the 3rd, ill-fated plane has less power than the gauges showed. The pilot was getting 25% less power than he thought because of false instrument readings as he went down the runway. The flight recorders showed that the 2 engines were working properly, according to the March the 7th article, but it remains uncertain what caused the clogging of the sensors. And I'll go into the clogging of the sensors and airplane sabotage in the next article that I want to get right into. One story said the snow may have been to blame, but they don't understand why the plane was put into reverse thrust. Now, that's identical to the Japanese airplane that went down a week later. New York Times says the conflict emerges in Air Florida crash testimony. The National Transportation Safety Board has contradictory views on the snow and ice accumulated and captains of other airlines, equally qualified witnesses, see different things. Another article, the aircraft began vibrating. As soon as it took off, it shook violently. There was something wrong before the plane took off. One of the passengers who survived said, "This isn't right. We are not going to make it." Another article, a San Jose Mercury pilot tells the board he would have aborted the flight. They were convinced they were not getting the correct instrument readings, yet they gave no indication they would stop. And a TWA pilot said that he left there 45 minutes before this plane, and it would have been possible to abort it. They should have. And finally, the controllers were called negligent in ruling on Air Florida that the plane coming behind them could come in. They told them that they had to get off the runway, you remember, and they're not going to be prosecuted for that, but they said there's a plane right behind you. And this one article this week said in the paper that they should have aborted the flight, that they were told by the controller, get out of the way, another plane is coming. Actually, they could have moved off the runway and not taken off. They had every indication something was going wrong, and they went ahead anyway. And that is a scary thing to know, that people could hear something going wrong, and the pilots could hear it. The control tower says, get going, and they went. And, of course, 78 people were killed 1 minute later, and they went right into the river. Now, going in quickly into the Soho News article, because this fits in so many loose ends of things that I've been talking about for a long, long time, and I like those kind of articles. This is called The Company They Keep, and it was in the Soho News, November 24th, 1981. That's out of New York, by Joe Pennington and Stanley Pinsley. In essence, about this article, and it's a long article, and I've outlined it for you. What it's saying is that there's an organization called The Company, and that organization has been involved with stealing military hardware from Navy intelligence in China Lake, California. It's involved in the killing of the drug judge who did harsh sentencing, Judge Wood in Texas. It's involved with international narcotic, heroin, cocaine, a $55 million a year operation just out of Colombia alone. The company is directly linked to Frank Turple and Congressman Jen Redd, who was removed because of Abscam. And the company also is simultaneously part of the Central Intelligence Agency when they stole at China Lake and sent equipment to Gaddafi or other countries. They were under the impression they were doing it for the CIA, and Frank Turple said that he's worked for the CIA up until the spring of this last year. And the company and the CIA are both the same, and it is the heroin cocaine operation, the drug smuggling, the assassination teams. And this article begins to bring them together, and it brings the Nugan Bank in Australia as the location of Mr. Chagra, who's now in jail in Texas. He was active in the Nugan Bank, which was the CIA heroin cocaine connections and the assassination teams. And it then takes them to the Las Vegas skimming money, which is an area which hasn't yet been linked to Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson and William Casey, who our CIA director, who is the attorney for Caesar's World, or Frank Sinatra, the Wells Fargo connections. Now, this article is the first article going into Navy intelligence, the Nugan, the drug connection, and bringing in the murder trials in the Southwest in Texas and going to the Vegas skimming money. So it's an important article because it begins to make that net or web very much closer and bring in elements that I try to define week to week and say that they will come together. And now people are coming out with articles that are making the links of these various agents and the way they operate, the way the United States government steals weapons from military bases, sells them for money. The money is parlayed into narcotics and guns in other countries, and then the narcotics are sold here at a tremendous profit, and then more military equipment is sold, and we are giving away military equipment with the approval of the Justice Department and of the CIA. And this is a story how the Justice Department sat on these stories for several years. And in the interim of their sitting on them, many of the people that I've mentioned that have been killed as a consequence of the investigations coming out are named in the article. And that's very important because there's a long list of murders, more than I have time for tonight, but murders related to these scandals as they unfolded. The Justice Department, the CIA in Washington, have known and contributed to this situation for a long, long time. Now private investigators are going into it and making connections on their own, so the Justice Department is forced to move slowly, and many primary witnesses are being killed. We'll take a 1-minute break, and I'll go to the article, Hostility between the Justice Department, the company, and the CIA.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
Okay, part two now is the company they keep, Soho News. Joe Pennington and Stanley Pinsley. I'll share with you what they have in this one article and interpret some of it as I go along. They begin by saying there's hostility between the Justice Department and the Central Intelligence Agency. There always has. They said it began with feuds of J. Edgar Hoover not wanting the OSS into his turf, and when the OSS became the CIA, the Justice and the CIA struggled over domestic and international covert operations. In 1978, the Senator Church Committee began investigating CIA activities in the United States in connection with Justice Department activities overlapping the organized crime syndicate of drug smuggling and gun running. And, of course, a lot of the syndicate figures like John Rosselli, Sam Giancana, and Santos Trafficana, Carlos Marcello came up when the House Select Committee on Assassinations began to scratch the surface of who killed John Kennedy. And again, you had the marriage of the CIA and the Justice Department, Robert Mayo of the FBI, Mayo, an agent of the CIA and counterintelligence, hiring people from organized crime to set up assassination teams. The Justice Department, the CIA, and organized crime have a strong marriage that hasn't divorced yet, and there's conflicts about who's on whose turf. They conflict with each other sometimes, but they've had this going, and it started to be exposed in 1978. Now, the FBI is not all corrupt, and the CIA is not all corrupt. So private investigators on their own began to open up pieces of information or evidence allegedly looking for crime figures, and they started an operation called Operation Gateway. The FBI started it, and they looked for leads between people of the syndicate and persons associated with the CIA. Well, you know, the CIA, that wouldn't go for that too long, even though Senator Church was going into this. They found links of the CIA with the mob, and the Justice Department found them, and the CIA pretended they would want to halt them. Keep in mind, of course, that in 1978, the CIA and the Justice want to halt the mob, and the CIA is running a bank of $55 million to $1 billion over in Australia of heroin and cocaine and gun running on their own. It'd be hard for the FBI to crack that one, but that's what the CIA was doing. Well, Operation Gateway started into 14 different states based in Washington, D.C., and one of the areas they went East St. Louis. 6 federal agencies were working with the FBI. There was the FBI, Drug Enforcement, Internal Revenue, Federal Aviation, U.S. Customs, and Treasury Department, and all 6 were active in Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Michigan. Operation Gateway was a cause of concern, according to these authors, to the intelligence community. Well, Navy intelligence, Army intelligence, and the Defense Department are into dope and drug dealing, so of course Operation Gateway was a cause of concern to them because, as they said, it pointed to white-collar criminal underworld that has a tangential and possibly substantial connection to men who were former CIA agents, professed covert agents, and drug enforcement agencies. And that, again, tangles down to those areas like the Nugan, the Wells Fargo, Jonestown, Mark David Chapman, William Colby, and that gang. When they went looking for trouble, they found former agents, present agents, and current drug enforcement agents. Operation Gateway was an undercover operation, and they were going to arrest and convict members of a group called the Company, which is a slang term for the CIA, but they called themselves the Company, and they had a lie detector test to screen people out. It's a very high, complicated organization with computers and so forth. Members of the Company are huge drug arms smuggling conspiracy with ties of elements to the intelligence community. That's what they found out with Operation Gateway. They had special province to investigate the criminal operations, and what they found was that not only was the CIA working with members of organized crime, such as like the Nugan Hand, the heroin cocaine, the Arab American, Southeast Asia, the Flying Tigers, the narcotics traffic coming in from Southeast Asia and also from the Golden Triangle. But they saw the movement of arms and weapons and secret electronic components. They weren't not only making money from selling guns and from selling narcotics, but they were selling electronic components all over the world to foreign governments. Now that links in later with Frank Churchill and Edwin Wilson. The stories about their operations began to break in the New York Times. Those were the Seymour Hersh articles, and also Jeff Gerth and Philip Taubman. And according to the Soho News, these stories read like pages from the Gateway Report. Edwin Wilson and Frank Churchill got media exposure unparalleled so far with CIA operations and CIA covert operations, but so far we've only heard about what they did in Uganda or in Libya, and we have not had the details of where they operated from 1960 through the 1970s, and that's important. How long did they work for the CIA? Edwin Wilson worked Navy intelligence, allegedly through 1976, but he was active in Nugan Hand with the assassination teams in Australia after that. Churchill allegedly left in 1971, according to the CIA, but these authors have talked to Frank Churchill on the telephone doing this story, and he said he's worked up through this last April 1981. And, of course, at the time of Watergate, those were ex-CIA people who were on the payroll of CIA at the time. The CIA denies their role of the agency with what is known as the company, but nevertheless, the evidence of the Justice Department makes it very clear by their reports that the company and the CIA and the drug connections and the assassination teams all fit together, are one and the same. The indictment for Churchill and Wilson was in April 1979 in Washington, D.C. for sending explosives to Libya shipped from California, an indictment for Churchill and Corcola for selling machine gun silencers and ammunition in New York City. Churchill, Wilson, and Corcola are now in the Middle East. They live in Beirut, Lebanon, and in Tripoli, Libya, and they're also in England. They're active at the present time with the PLO. They train PLO terrorists and technicians. They send special force agents there, and they purchase American equipment, which is easily sent by the CIA for them. And this article briefly mentions Billy Carter, Robert Vesco, and Frank Churchill working together. And in January 1981, they said that Churchill was an intermediary for Gaddafi, and they wanted Billy Carter to help deliver those 8 C-130 air transports that Gaddafi wanted. They were parked in Atlanta, Georgia, as I said, but he got them from other people, including Neil Burke, who then went to Western Airlines and is active trying to manage Western Airlines at the present time. Frank Churchill has been talking with these authors in the article and said that he's been involved in shady deals and that the deals were commonplace in the CIA. And as I say, they've been exposing their activity. And while they were active in the CIA, again, I have to remind you, George Bush was director of the CIA during these time periods, 1976, 1977. This article says the most tantalizing part about Operation Gateway in the CIA are their ties to activities not called the company, because the company until now, or hopefully the CIA thought people would separate the company from the CIA. The company, they say, is the nickname for the CIA. The company has been defined as a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise, some of the largest drug smuggler operations in the United States by way of Colombia and other South American nations. Details of the company have not yet appeared on the national news, and that's why I said that the Jenrette story, Congressman Jenrette and Robert Vesco, and the links of them to the company are supposed to be the largest narcotic operations going in the world today, or at least until they became visible by the exposures. The company, according to Operation Gateway, specializes in cocaine, marijuana, produces synthetic drugs. Their primary activity is the extensive exchange of guns and weapons, which they obtain in the United States American military bases, which we pay for with our taxes and pay the guards to guard, and then they send them away in exchange for South American drugs, which come back that they sell at their profit. They operate on the East Coast, all along the southern states, and in the Midwest. They use voice and polygraph stress tests to test the members of their loyalty in the company. And they've become associated with 30 legitimate businesses in the United States, including electronic and food industries. Now, this is what happened with IG Farben after World War II, setting up 750 companies. You can't expose IG Farben. You can't expose these legitimate companies because they would go broke now and go under. So they have a vested interest once they bought into the system. So the company is now involved with at least 30, in quotes, legitimate businesses. And anybody who talks gets the threat of murder from the company people. They have the means for gun running, drugs, and the CIA, and they threaten to kill. Frank Turple was in the CIA, as I say, until April 1981. He told these authors he's familiar with the company, but he can't talk about the relationship of the CIA and company, and he can't go into details. Now, the first indictments of Operation Gateway after the Justice Department went on them were in St. Louis, Missouri. They were handed down November 1980. It involved $50 million worth of drugs coming through there, and 11 individuals were named. They were all clients of the company. Then another man named Marvin Zylstra, Zylstra, or his nickname Starvin' Marvin, was one of the leaders of the company. His home base is Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and he was indicted for sabotaging the fuel system of an airline, leading to the death of a drug enforcement informer. That reminds me of the Air Florida going down to Florida, and the system was clogged, and they can't find out why part of that plane was clogged, so that what the pilots read was not accurate, in fact, what they were supposed to be seeing when they took off. Well, this team, the company and the CIA, out of Florida, had a man who was an expertise at sabotaging planes, and they also worked, these teams, with destroying other planes and blowing them up and heading assassination teams. That's no trick. So this Starvin' Marvin, or Marvin Zylstra, was arrested for and convicted April 25th, 1981, for operating large-scale drug smuggling operation and for sabotaging the fuel system of an airline in Florida. Robert Snyder of Lexington, Kentucky, another of the 11 company members, was indicted for racketeering and criminal enterprises, and he's known as a prominent polygraph expert. There are indictments in Florida, St. Louis, some were picked up in Illinois. Representative John Jenrette has an assistant aide, John R. Etheridge. Etheridge is another man who was implicated in the company. Jenrette only briefly was mentioned in his relationship to Robert Vesco and narcotics traffic. And this aide, John Etheridge, was a former aide to Jenrette. Jenrette was convicted in the AB scam story. And one of the biggest stories yet is to take Frank Turple and Vesco and Richard Allen and the whole team out of the Libya connections and the Japanese connections and put them with the syndicate and the crime connections that fit together with William Casey of the CIA and the people that are in the White House today, the Reagans, and their organized crime friends from California and Beverly Hills. Now, 40 more indictments are due against company members soon, and I would say lots of luck, because if there's 40 indictments, imagine how much they're going to talk. Now, this article goes into a guy named Jamil Alexander Chagra, C-H-A-G-R-A. He's one of the heads of the company, and Operation Gateway discovered that Chagra was one of the big regional wholesale dealers, and he got convicted for selling drugs for the company, and he is one of the main leaders of the company. But the same Chagra, who's been dealing with known as the company, the group that stole from China Lake, that worked with Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple, he works with the Central Intelligence Agency, and he also operated out of the Nugan Bank in Australia. Chagra has worked with the Australian Connections and the Australian Narcotics Bureau, said that he was associated with the Nugan Bank in Australia, an institution tied totally to the CIA, to CIA money and agents. It seems to me that several years ago, when we were talking about Nugan Bank, I went into this on the air, but The company linked to the CIA, that they're one of the same, and Charach and the assassination teams linked to Nugan and it involves the money in Australia that allegedly was missing. Nobody's claimed it, but it's so tied up with narcotics traffic that I'm sure it's been removed from the country and been used to buy off people in this country since the Nugan Bank fell. Nugan Bank had the shadiest dealings, according to this author, and Charach was involved in the bank. Their dealings were such that they were investigated in mid-1979, going back to 79, following allegations that that bank was instrumental in facilitating an operation to skim money from Las Vegas casinos for U.S. organized crime boss Joe Banana. Now, this is the first article I've seen linking the casino skimming to the crime organized figures in Joe Banana out of California, and he also works out of Nevada, but Joe Banana's headquarters in California. An investigator for the Australian Narcotic Bureau has revealed that Charach's name surfaced repeatedly in connection with alleged skimming schemes coming out of Vegas. And as I said before, I believed that the Wells Fargo story broke, that 200 to 300 million that's missing, the 80,000 a week that was offered to Harold Smith coming out of Nigeria. I believe that the reason the Wells Fargo story broke and they had to make a patsy out of Harold Smith was that when the feds went into investigating the Nugan Bank, he would lead right to Beverly Hills, to the Wells Fargo Bank, and to Caesar's Palace of Frank Sinatra and Ronald Reagan and the mob about Reagan. And I said that the Nugan story and the Wells Fargo story could be a Reagan gate if it were followed properly, just like Richard Nixon would have been out much, much earlier if we went into Murray Chotiner and the organized crimes of the B.B. Rabeaus and the Howard Hughes and the mob connections to Richard Nixon. We might have even avoided the Vietnam War if you'd done your homework and saved all those lives and time and money and divisiveness and energy. Now, I believe that the way that some of these missing millions and billions began to be explained in the Justice Department was as they went to search for this money, they would tap these crime forces and that the banks would transfer from one bank to another to cover their bases so they wouldn't be investigated. But going to Australia and looking into the Nugan, which they had to do because 12 people died shortly after the bank collapsed, and one was John Paisley of Navy Intelligence and the National Security Council, who had worked in that department with Lee Harvey Oswald and in the Soviet Union, and Bernard Fensterwald, the attorney for Mrs. James McCord of the CIA, the attorney who had the committee to investigate assassinations, became Mrs. Paisley's attorney. This was kill money that was being set up as it had been earlier before the Dallas years at another bank, the Republic National Bank in Texas and other banks around the country. The Nugan had a lot of kill money for destabilizing countries, and they also mixed it with the crime and mob money. So in investigating the Nugan Bank, they came to the skimming money in Vegas, which gets awfully close to home because Paul Laxalt, he's now a senator of Nevada, he was the governor when the Howard Hughes gang and the syndicate were all very close there. I mean, he's one of the ruling people of the Nevada establishment. He ran the campaign for Ronald Reagan, and he's in the Senate, being the appeaser of the Senate between the White House. He's the man who sits right next to Ronald Reagan, who the Hughes syndicate people chose to be a president someday. So out of that state, out of that skimming money, where Paul Laxalt comes, it's going down to Nugan. And I knew there'd be that full cycle of Nugan to Beverly Hills to Vegas, and this article has it. The article says the CIA drugs and espionage activities took place at the Nugan Bank. Some of their bank members and persons had CIA connections, and this has been publicly documented. And following the disappearance of two of its founders, who were Americans, Frank Nugan murder and the disappearance of Michael Hand and the murder of John Paisley, the Justice Department had to go into it. Now, this is what this article is saying. The bank's underworld ties have not yet been publicly documented. They've talked about CIA heroin and the connections in London Times and the New York Post and so forth, but it hasn't yet come out the skimming Vegas connections to the Nugan Bank. Both the CIA and the organization known as the company have significant ties to the Nugan Bank. This is the Soho News. The Australian bank employers admit to officials of the Australian Narcotic Bureau that the bank's clients included drug dealers, gun runners, and the CIA. The Nuganan Bank was used for numerous arms deals, and this was for Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, Navy intelligence, and money was sent down for the military junta that killed Salvador Allende. That was one of their lovelier murders. Now, Charach, a member of the criminal underworld who's been implicated as a company conduit, has also ties to the Nuganan Bank in Australia and ties to the Central Intelligence Agency and to gun running and to the stealing of weapons out of arsenals. Now, as far as the deaths, the assassinations, and murders that follow when information comes out, the agent who began to investigate the company, who began the first work for the FBI, was a man named Sante Alessandro Barrio. He was following Jimmy Charach in 1978. He was arrested by the Drug Enforcement Agency and put in San Antonio jail, where he died from a John Belushi piece of food. They called it a peanut butter sandwich. He was in a coma 3 months, and he died. He was the federal agent, narcotics agent, who became a federal narcotics agent in 1969. He was promoted to the station section chief in Mexico City. He did the brilliant work of putting together the links of the company, the CIA, and what was going down in Australia, the Nuganan Bank. He wrote a report called Operation Croupier, and when he called the federal agents together to tell them that he had put together Jimmy Charach and all these interconnecting links, you can imagine how thrilled the Justice Department and the CIA were that this man did this work. So he was murdered. He had a meeting. He called people together in September 1978, and in August, in Mexico City. And a month after the meeting, he was arrested, and he was murdered on this particular sandwich. He took one bite, threw it in the toilet. Minutes later, he dropped on the ground in convulsions. He died a few months later in a coma. His wife said that he had been poisoned, that there was strychnine, and so forth. He had a similar demise as Mama Cass, Jimi Hendrix, and John Belushi. Then along came the federal judge who was to prosecute Charach on the narcotics dealing and connections, but the Drug Enforcement Agency, the FBI, and the Justice Department had them linked to a much bigger operation, and Judge Wood was attacked and murdered. A U.S. attorney assisting Judge Wood was almost killed November 21st, 1978. He was going to prosecute Charach for narcotics trafficking. He's got a new identity, James Kerr. He's left the state of Texas. He wasn't killed, but he's not recognized, and he doesn't work for the federal government anymore. Judge Wood was attacked and murdered as he was leaving his home, and people linked to that murder, charged with that murder, have not yet been prosecuted. It's been 33 months, and they're about ready to go into the murder of Judge Wood. He was killed May 29th, 1979, and that's the anniversary of my birthday and Kennedy's birthday, May 29th, Judge Wood. And it's been 33 months, and they haven't had the nerve to prosecute the people for killing him. Now, they brought in, this is a really great one, they brought in Mr. Lowell Jensen from Washington, D.C. This is 33 months after Judge Wood was murdered, and they had all the names and information earlier. But the Washington Department decided to take over the case of this murder of the judge, and the reason they did was because it's so large and so controversial. So who did they bring in? Mr. Lowell Jensen, the Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division. I mentioned Lowell Jensen in 1981, February 22nd, a year ago, on this program. D.A. Jensen is to get a high Justice Department post. He is a man from Alameda County, I mentioned, involved in covering up the SLA, the real story of the SLA, the free speech movement, the Berkeley demonstrations. He worked with Edwin Meese III and Ronald Reagan with Operation Chaos, the COINTEL program. He's now is going to be Assistant U.S. Attorney General in charge of the Criminal Division. So what you get is the fox prosecuting and guarding the chickens. I said a year ago that Jensen was trouble, and Washington has sent him out there to find out who should be indicted in the Judge Wood case and what the charges will be. This is February 28th, 1982, Washington Post. They're still wondering, not the New York Times, they're wondering what should Mr. Jensen do, how far should they go into the murder of Judge Wood, because these guys may be killed off who, if they're held for the murder, they may talk and be killed off. And the deaths compile to a point where they can't keep killing every witness, and eventually this story is going to come out. Now, on August the 6th, 1978, Mr. Barrow, the federal drug agent, made the links of the company, the CIA, the Nugan Bank, and the skimming money. And in September, he was arrested by the Drug Enforcement, and then he died. This is in 1978. In September 15th of 78, John Hart of the House Select Committee was talking about John Paisley and Lee Harvey Oswald. And 1 week later, John Paisley, who had direct contact with the Nugan Bank in 1978, went off his ship and died, and a CIA attorney is representing his wife. As I say, that was a mystery linked to the Kennedy assassination, the House Select Committee, the Nugan and again, Navy intelligence gun-running assassination teams. November 18th, 1978, Lee O'Ryan went down to Jonestown to investigate what was going on because there was CIA activity and gun running, narcotics traffic, and of course he and 923 other people were killed. And I believe that properly investigated, the money for the original Jonestown will go right back to Nugan. May 29th, 1979, Judge Wood was murdered, and January 27th, 1980, Frank Nugan was murdered, and Michael Hand took the powder. Now, there was an arrest January the 5th, 1980, just before Frank Nugan died, a man named Bradley Bryant, who carried with him the connecting link of the company, the CIA. He was arrested, the China Lake robberies, and he was a man who had a security service who was picked up on a fluke. He was arrested, and on his person, he had the information that connect the Nugan, the CIA, the company, and Bryant worked for Chagra, he worked for the CIA, and with him was a lot of equipment that was stolen, and sophisticated equipment and records of the China Lake robbery of Navy intelligence, including classified image-enhancing rifle night scopes, sophisticated telephone scrambling devices. This is what Bradley Bryant had when the New York police arrested him January the 5th, 1980. This is at the Sheraton Hotel in Philadelphia. He had equipment taken from the naval base in California. He had pistol silencers, commando-style daggers, ski masks, false identification papers, bogus gun permits from several states, links of his activity to Navy intelligence. And this fluke arrest in Philadelphia set off, again, January the 5th, 1980, is when this arrest took place. And then it was right after that, the arrest, January 27th, that Frank Nugan was murdered in Australia. Now, this one article, I didn't have time to go into several others I wanted to bring up this evening, but we'll do it next week. This one article is very important because there were a continuous series of deaths of Frank Nugan, John Paisley, Judge Wood, and a lot more. I have many files of deaths related to this case, but it's important because people working for the intelligence community are not supposed to be working in the United States in the first place. They're not supposed to be a Gestapo in the United States, and that's what the CIA is. It is that. They're supposed to protect us from foreign spies, and they take valuable equipment, assassination teams, silencers, telescopes, rockets, airplane transports, and send them to people who are supposed to be our enemy, but they're arming them to the hilt, such as Gaddafi, the PLO, Idi Amin before he was kicked out, but around other countries. They are transporting airplanes, jeeps. They go to North Carolina and take the special forces and take American soldiers to train these people. And the media is trying to identify for us who are our enemies and who are our friends, while the intelligence community is arming the people that they're telling us are our enemies. In truth, the only enemy they seem to think they have is the Soviet Union. But the intelligence community is stealing out of the armories. They are passing weapons on. They trade weapons for narcotics. They can kill judges, private citizens. anyone that stands in their way. They are a combination of the intelligence community, the Justice Department that's covered all of this up. Every time they go to investigate it, they kill the investigators and poison them with the food, the strychnine and so forth, that blow up planes. That's why I think they can have access to Air Florida if they want to get Mr. Williams or anybody else or Mrs. Tirado, Mr. Tirado, George Bush's buddy. There's people from Fairchild. The point is that there are articles now, and there'll be more, and books, hopefully, showing the mess that this country is in by these people paid salaries to protect, who are throwing things out the window that are locked up, selling them, taking the money, bringing narcotics into this country, selling the narcotics, gun running, no morals, no hold on them, no Justice Department, no police force stopping them. They have had carte blanche of almost every agency, and they've been doing this for a long time. This article and that one Wall Street Journal on the Air Florida, I think, are very interesting, and we'll do the other things we didn't have time for this week. We never do have enough time, but the hour is up. So I'll be back with you next week. This is Mae Brussell and Carmel, and you take care of yourself.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.
This is for all you headbangers out there.
KLRB Carmel.
You know who you are.